The Senior Rehab Project is supported by the Game Changers, a group of motivated rehab clinicians that are crushing mediocrity and advancing care for older adults. You can join this group of people and get access to the private Facebook group, the monthly meetup with article discussions, and have a say in the direction of this movement. Get off the sidelines and get involved. Just go to seniorrehabproject.com/Game Changers. Hit me!
This is a Senior Rehab Podcast, the podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults. And now your host, my grandson, Dusty Jones.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. This is Dustin Jones, the creator of SRP. It's good to talk to you. Today's episode is the recording of the Game Changers meetup, where we discuss Dale Avers' white paper, Strength Training for the Older Adult. This is a foundational paper written in 2009 that has been very helpful for me and many of you all that listen to this podcast. But we tried to dissect it and just see how could it be improved, what we love about it and what we think, can be tweaked a little bit. This is going to be a little different. Typically, the Game Changers episodes that we release are just the last, 10, 15 minutes as a summary of our discussion. But today's episode, we're just going to release the whole thing, the whole conversation, just so y'all can get an idea of what it's like to be a part of the Game Changers meetup. So if you listen to this and it's interesting and you think you would benefit from it, which I definitely think you would, it's a pretty awesome group of people that you can talk to regularly, discuss some of this research, and actually apply it in your practice. But you can go to seniorrehabproject.com and you'll see a link on the homepage. But without further ado, the Game Changers discussion on Dale Avers' white paper, Strength Training for the Older Adult. Enjoy. This is, one of those kind of prereqs for geriatric PT in terms of articles that you should read. But we're going to get on this call and discuss how can we make it better? What will we change? What will we keep? How can we make this better, more effective to reach more people in our profession? So we happen to actually have Dale on the call. Good evening, Dale. How are you?
Hi there. It's good to be here.
I'm very glad that you're joining us. But I wanted to start off, let's give people kind of a background on, let's do this. The goal for this paper when you wrote it, and now think of what do you want it to achieve if it were to be published today or republished?
Good question. Yeah. So, 10 years ago, strength training was still not very adapted and embraced by therapists. And I like to think it is a little bit more now. I hope. But certainly what I was looking for was a quick and dirty way of getting the main points out about strengthening and to give concrete ideas about how to do it. So, getting how many reps, how many sets. This is what you can do in an inpatient setting if you are seeing somebody every day. So thinking about all my teaching and all the what ifs and buts and, I can't. Yeah. So I really tried to address all of that in this little paper. And fast forwarding that 10 years, I was just reading it again tonight. There are some things that have changed. I think we have to acknowledge that there is some pretty good evidence that lower intensity actually increases strength, but we need to kind of talk about that and when that's appropriate. And maybe make the examples more relevant. And I'm a little concerned about the charts and the 1 rep maxes and their equations to how many reps, and not quite sure I want to really include those.
Yeah. Cool.
Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. All right. So Shweta, good evening. She just logged on, coming out of Utah. I have a few logistical questions before we all dive in, because I think that's going to help me think about this paper. What are the constraints that you have when you submit something like this to a journal? Like, do you have to? Are you only allotted X number of pages? do you have to stick to like their certain format? Like how much flexibility do you have when you submit something like this to a journal?
When I wrote this one, there weren't very many constraints, but the editor was also a good friend, so maybe that's why. We were just looking to get the message across.
Yeah.
Because it was before the certification course, all of that. Now, I don't know how well it's going to be received in the journal. I haven't really checked on it, but I think it's going to be published, somewhere. So I'm not so concerned about the constraints because it is going to be up to the editors as to what they want to do.
Okay. And then for those that were wondering, what is a white paper? So I looked it up. A white paper, it is an authoritative report or guide that informs readers concisely about a complex issue and presents the issuing body's philosophy on the matter. It is meant to help readers understand an issue, solve a problem, or make a decision. So when I read that, it's like authoritative paper. Is it poor form if a white paper is presented as a story or kind of case based? Does it need to be facts and all the data to support it? Just kind of like just a very dense article. Is that kind of
it needs to be pretty definitive.
Yeah.
And reflective of the evidence and not as much opinion.
Okay. What, writing articles based on opinion is bad or dangerous? What?
They can be starts.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I wish my PhD would be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a podcaster. I just say whatever I want and I can just publish on the internet. It's like,
oh, nice. You don't have to back it up. You just
right,
say.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So let's if we all have it here pulled up, let's just kind of go through from the beginning.
I would actually love to hear from some of the new grads because Dale, this is like all of the work that you've put in here. I feel like I get to put this into practice every single day and it's still extremely relevant to everything that we try and teach and even some of my doctoral work. I would love to hear how somebody who maybe doesn't have like any, or is just starting in terms of experience, how they interpreted this paper. If they could really read this paper and then put it into clinical practice the next day. Because I think that was the intent with the white.
It really is. Yeah.
So I've actually been in where I'm at now in my clinical. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah. You sound great.
Okay. I've been programming group classes, and then doing like some individual stuff too, but mainly group. And so I've been trying to look at all of these things, and I actually compared this to like other strength training articles that I've found that are kind of all inclusive like this. And I really think it's all inclusive. I'm focusing a lot on power. So, that was helpful to have that seen in here. But yeah, I definitely refer to these kinds of things a lot when I'm doing programming and stuff like that. And especially like RPE and then figuring out like 1 rep maxes or how to do that otherwise. Cause I see a lot of like very old people. So learning kind of how to adapt that. So I really do think that it's pretty all inclusive on my end.
But a couple things came up. Like I think it'd be neat to maybe include a little bit about group classes, and especially with the point that it's awfully hard to get 80% of a 1RM in a group class, but aiming for 40 to 60 is the goal. And then maybe even talk about domes a little bit.
Yeah. I agree. And in a group class, honestly, I've been just trying to use RPE because even like they only have like small weights. So we do a lot of like higher rep things or like for time intervals. Right. And then I always just ask like RPE, trying to stay in that like 6 to 8-ish range and then kind of judge it from there. So yeah, we honestly don't really do 1 rep max in group stuff, but I mean, I'm sure other people are, but yeah, it's more of a RPE for me.
Excuse me. I do think Well, the table on the first page is money. Like I love that. That just kind of puts everything into perspective. Money is a technical term there for y'all. But it
I wish it brought me money.
it ties everything together. And it's very practical. Like I find that I use that more than anything, I use RPE more than anything, but just refer back to that table. But, let's see here. Table 2A, how to determine intensity with 1 rep max as a starting value. That table I find very valuable as well to establish, appropriate intensity or baseline. Especially, I'm biased because I'm in home health, but I don't have a lot of increments in weights to be able to determine, just nail down that 1 rep max. But I can give someone, the weights that I do have and probably get them, to do the activity, 5 to 10, do a submax test and then calculate based off that. And now, I can even do that with, an app on my phone that, is basically this table in a very easy to use app. So I think that table right there and the RPE are definitely the most practical.
Are the two.
Yeah, that are going to be used by people. And so to highlight those and to bring a lot of attention to them and even mention the technology that we do have now to make this stuff easy, because I know for me and just many people even in SRP, when we talk about this stuff, it's like, okay, this is cool, this is great, but I don't have time. I don't have time to do that. Right. Is what you always hear. Like, we do have time. We got to make the time, but there's a lot of perceived barriers to it, and I feel like these two tables can help overcome a lot of the perceived barriers by people.
Yeah, and I feel like especially with older adults, people are hesitant with the 1 rep max, but having these numbers right there to say it's still feasible to find it without it. Because I know for me, when I first was trying to figure out okay, how do I find a 1 rep max when I don't have very many weights or they're a little bit more frail kind of thing. Now being in practice, I think a little bit differently about that. But I agree. These two tables are probably the most helpful.
I think I need to carry it to a 15 RM though.
Yeah.
To get it down to 60%,
Yeah.
That would help.
I think, like you mentioned, I think there's several things that have changed in the past decade that you'd want to touch on. So group classes is one of them. Like that's we've always had group classes, but they're starting to become more discussed.
They're critical now.
Yeah.
Right.
The literature on high intensity interval training is a whole lot better now, and pretty awesome.
I had that highlighted. That because in the injury paragraph it says it's our opinion that using high intensity resistance requires one-on-one supervision, blah blah blah, to observe form. So I read that wrong. I guess I thought it was just high intensity in general, but I was thinking the same thing, that high intensity training and like you said, low intensity. So showing that both of those could.
That's a good point. And then the stuff with the Lift More trial.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about it. Like I know you mentioned the closed chain activities and just kind of, I loved how you broke that down, by the way, like the specificity and functional strength training, especially for frail individuals, task specificity may be a critical parameter to improve function rather than intensity because of diminished reserve and increased bodily fatigue. Like that's super helpful to think through for so many people. But
that DeVried article is one of my very favorites.
Yeah.
That prompted a study I did, and that functional activity and exercise equals resistance training at a very high intensity for really frail people.
Yeah.
So
what article was that?
The DeVried one.
DeVried. It's 32.
Okay.
But I feel like Yeah, because it's hard. I'm trying to think like, who reads this stuff in this day and age? Like people that, subscribe to the Journal of Geriatric PT and just thinking like, how far will this go? Like, is it a goal to reach people beyond the geriatric PT world, like people in outpatient ortho? And if it's published in here, can they get access to it easily? Mm-hmm. I think it's something that I was thinking about as I was reading this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is widely available now. I think enough people have posted it. I've posted it. So I think it does. And it's been referenced by a wide variety of professionals. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the nature of a white paper.
Okay.
It's easy, quick, and highly referenced.
But at first, was it behind like the paywall or was it open access?
It might have been behind a paywall initially. Yeah.
Yeah. So just how broad, it has been dispersed. I just think of like some of the, language that could be used to draw those types of people in. Mm-hmm. So like if you mention the word barbell or squat or just something like that just like someone like Alyssa or Christina would be like, oh, you got my attention. You're like, like the person that may not be like all about, geriatric PT, but when they see that word, it may like draw them in. I think about some of that language or the sexy language in a way, just to break some stereotypes of what we do as geri PTs.
I think that we have to be careful though, like when we're trying to publish in an academic journal, like they're starting to, but I know that one of the things that I always get critiqued on in some of my writing is that I tend to talk in a very colloquial way because I want it to be accessible to clinicians. And, but when you're trying to publish in academic journals, it can actually work against you. So I think what you're talking about, Dustin, isn't necessarily the white paper, but how we disseminate it once the white paper has been published. So for example, like taking some of these tables and turning them into infographics that then can permeate into more social media streams that links back to this white paper. Because then this becomes like the white paper becomes like the credibility, like where like the authority is, and then the way that we disseminate it, and even like the Senior Rehab Project, how that gets disseminated. I think that's where the real, like the snowball can really come into play. So if we can really kind of nail down, what do we want to say and what additions do we want to make over the last 10 years? And then, like use the social media traction to kind of bring back to that authority. It just raises the credibility of it. And then we have all of the tools to, get the eyeballs on that paper.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Man, multi-syllable words.
And maybe all we have to do is say an updated white paper, and then that gets the attention and gets disseminated. You build on what's already there.
Yeah. Dale, some of the things that I was thinking about with this paper that there's been more literature to date is actually making, you kind of mentioned DOMs, but also fatigue and rest periods.
Yes.
Because there's been some randomized control trials now that have taken different styles of resistance training for older adults and then done more qualitative and quality of life variables and talked about, how older adults respond in regard to fatigue and enjoyment of different exercise programs. And then making a comment at the end that we have all of these variables, but essentially the one that's going to be the most successful is the one that people do.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
So like we have all of these tools in our toolbox, but we have to make sure that we're kind of bringing the client in, and maybe like some of the psychosocial things, like,
I like that. Yeah.
And bringing, like, Dustin talks a lot about being a hope dealer. And so how do we tie some of that into strength training? Because like, for example, the Liftmore trial really carried ripples because it was really challenging a norm. And we're continuing to see those positive reframing of aging and capability, but I think we still have a far way to go. But a white paper like this might be able to push that needle just a little bit further.
Yeah, I love the idea of including the engagement piece and how to keep people engaged, because that's one of the benefits of strength training, isn't it? Is they do get excited about what they're doing. Yeah. Great suggestions.
And then the other thing, that I wanted to mention is that there's been some work on adherence rates and how attrition and adherence really dictates, obviously, physical performance. And so for falls prevention programming, they kind of did a logistic regression, and they showed that if adherence and attendance was over 80%, then we started seeing statistically significant findings.
Right.
And I think that's an important part, especially with some of these group exercise models. You know, one-on-one, I know if my client doesn't show up, but if I have a group of 15 and some person falls off my radar for a week, 2 weeks, and then they come back, you know, that type of, those complicating factors into some of these exercise programs are definitely
right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Another good point. Yeah, I think what's not emphasized in here is really how long it takes to get stronger, and that may not be an hour episode of care, and how important it is to do a continuum, which will promote that adherence. So kind of putting in a paragraph about that, I think, would be really important. Yeah.
And I think we're in a really good kind of thought process as a profession in terms of, you know, the Academy of Health Promotions and Preventions, you know, that maintenance.
Yeah.
And I know that the introduction, you had a good kind of synopsis about some of the things that we see with age, but we could really use that argument about, you know, this is some of the quote unquote, like typical trajectories of aging, and this is how resistance training can mitigate some of those losses. You can really kind of pair those up and then say, you know, this is why this isn't a short-term process, this is a long-term process.
Right.
You know, it takes that amount of time, and sometimes seeing no decline in function is a positive outcome. And
right.
So, you know, some of that reframing, I think, is that would be awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things that I struggled with when I first wrote this was the lack of evidence that strengthening actually improves function, mostly because function's such a low level. And so it's when you get stronger, you supersede that. And I didn't know whether or not I wanted to tackle that. And I still don't know if I want to tackle that, because it gets a little, hard to explain sometimes. But the point being, and I think what I want therapists to know, is that function is such a low level. It doesn't take a lot of strength to get up from a chair and to even walk. 15% of baseline, that's all it takes to stand upright. And when people can't, because they lean on a walker, they've lost 85% of their strength. That's profound. And what should drive therapists to do something, and do something immediately that's effective. Yeah. So maybe kind of putting some of those things in. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think that would fit really well in the minimum stimulus overload section. I mean, that's kind of where you called out the focus on emphasizing motor learning, you know, and just how that, you know, that only gets you so far.
That had to be edited many times to make it polite.
Yeah, I loved it. But yeah, I feel like that could be slid into that little section. Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't use italics on that sentence, because at the end, what was it? Oh, I loved it. I freaking loved it. However, inadequate resistance is too often seen in the clinic, where 2-pound weights are commonly used and an arbitrary number of repetitions to perform is given. And then in italics, without a quantitative baseline assessment of strength, strengthening without rationale or adequate stimulus is tantamount to malpractice. But I could just hear you slamming on the desk as you're saying that.
I was too.
Yeah.
A lot of frustration was released in this article.
Yeah.
I bet.
The beautiful thing is, it's hard to improve on. You know, it's literally just updating.
Yeah,
you know?
It is updating, sure. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, this evidence, I wrote it at a time when the evidence was pretty solid, and we've just added to it.
Right.
What about this, so I always get pushback about, well, that's fine for outpatient when you're only seeing people 2 or 3 times a week, but what about if you're seeing them every day? And that's why I came up with this table, and it's in the Jerry book as well.
Table 3?
Yeah, table 3, right. Do you think it's helpful? Do you think it's confusing? You know, I'd love to hear Alyssa and
Chris. Yeah.
Does that help? Yeah.
At first it was a little confusing. Then once I looked at it into a little bit more, I guess my thing would be, it's just more of like a blanket statement, I guess, instead of like individualizing kind of what they need. So for like a general patient, but I almost think like just some ideas of each of these kind of things and like then trying to individualize it for a patient versus like this is what you should do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday kind of thing. That was just kind of my take on it. I think it was almost just a little too specific. But I haven't treated very many patients, so but that was just my take on it. I almost just think it's a little too specific.
What do you think, Chris? If you just glance at table 3.
Oh yeah, I'm looking at it right now. But overall, it's just like a example of like how you program based on the week and organizing by muscle group or basic activity. As she said, like you have to cater to the patient's needs, and of course, like I guess this gives like a very good template on like how to organize certain things. And I think that this is overall pretty solid. I'm just trying to see what I'm supposed to be focusing on over here. But like, every other day it seems that we're working on gait speed and working on lower extremity stuff. And I'm just trying to see what the last 2 rows are specifically, how those differ. You're switching off between a static balance and dynamic balance, correct?
Yeah, and then task-specific activities, the last row.
Yeah. All right. I guess this is, I like, again, like this is not really just like some kind of cookie cutter thing that you're just supposed to apply to every patient, but I guess it gives you a good base and you just make your own like little adjustments over there.
Yeah.
It's like that like rule that you should always give, like what, if you're you don't like work the same muscle group like 2 days in a row, it's kind of like
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to get across, because so often what you see is doing the same thing every single freaking day.
Yeah.
I am definitely guilty of that in my past clinicals, because, I see these patients every single day in like the SNF that I was at. And then I'm just thinking to myself, shouldn't I be doing something else differently instead of just doing, 3 sets of 10 with the ankle weights for the lower extremity? Do I really need to see these people 5 days a week if they still need to be recovering from something? But I guess, what I could have done is just change up the activity, just try to do the strengthening component every other day, and then just try to work on a balance thing. Between.
Yep.
This table, I feel like your point with the table could be portrayed, with words, definitely. But I feel it is valuable. But I wonder, and I don't know, if that would be too much real estate on this paper. But even like tying, almost everything that you talk about, and this table kind of being that practical example, maybe even including. The percentage of the rep max that you're using and the rep and set scheme, and just kind of like that tangible example of programming in terms of intensity and volume, but also, the type, like what are you actually doing? I could see that being a really cool opportunity to be that tangible example to present to people. But then logistically, I could see that being a massive table, but there may be ways to make it look pretty.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Sorry. I also think there could be instead of doing the table this way, you could almost do in terms of like program design. The more I work with older adults, the more I think of them as like my master's athletes with a more complex medical history. And so, if I'm seeing them twice a week, then I might do whole body twice a week. If I'm seeing them 3 times a week, I might go lower because I'm going to focus on lower, upper, lower. If I'm seeing them 4 times a week, I'm like a lower, upper, and then have different examples and kind of change things up to make it a little bit more exciting and things like that. So if I don't know how much, kind of the way Dustin said, real estate it would take up to look at program prescription and programming
for different settings,
settings, or like based on a goal. And you could even do a spectrum of that goal. So if I'm seeing a person who's 60 in an outpatient setting who's pretty independent versus a 95-year-old that Dustin may be seeing who's a little bit more homebound, you're just scaling. And based on the setting and the environment.
Yeah, that's where I see the dissemination is examples like that. I think that would be great.
So if the exercise, if the programming principles were embedded into the white paper, and then the dissemination was applying it to cases.
I like the case example though, because sometimes I feel when I'm reading articles, like it's fine that you state all these facts, but then it's how do you actually apply this? And especially like being a new grad and not having a lot of experience, I kind of rely on more of this like practical stuff and then kind of figure out my way along the way. But I think definitely having some sort of case example would definitely help out too.
Great. Maybe video too. Yeah.
And that's probably, I mean, the CEAA, like that's bridging that gap for sure. I mean, I know it's definitely a lot of case examples. And
it'd be great to have a video of some power exercises and functional exercises along from a frail all the way up to a master's athlete. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe how to test a 1RM.
That would be good, I think.
Yeah. Because I forget which, it was one of the threads on the SRP Facebook group. And it's like, we talk a lot about 1RM and percentages, but I don't think people know how to do it. I don't think a lot of people have done it practically.
That's right.
And I mean, I'll admit that it wasn't until I was in a gym, working in the fitness industry that I actually performed, a rep max. Even though I went to physical therapy school and they talked about it, but I never, even in my clinicals, I never performed it, but
drives me crazy.
I know, and I'm sure like for you, Dale, you're like, we shouldn't even be wasting our time like on doing a video for, how to do a 1 rep max. I mean, do you feel like that should be like just common knowledge that was taught in PT school?
Yeah, I do, but it's not. So you have to. That's why you do these things.
Yeah.
Is there like a 1 rep max calculator that I could just Google and then I just find it that way? Because I mean, I try to calculate the 1 rep max on myself, but I never thought to myself, oh yeah, I could do that for my patients. And
right.
Get started on that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's tougher for just like home health. It can be challenging, even it can be challenging even in a nursing home. You just like say your patient's bedbound. I mean, there's ways to definitely get that baseline, but it's just not as simple as say you're trying to get a 1 rep max on a knee extensor machine. You can just pull that pin and it's a lot simpler, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I take my students through that. So they have to do a 1RM on a machine, on 2 machines. They do it on themselves first. And then by the time they get to Jerry, they do it on older people. But I also have them do a body weight exercise. And that always throws them a little bit. But I drop the 1 RM and just talk about a repetition maximum.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's not part of the confusion, is they think they've got to do it one time. Well, how do I do that? When you're looking at function? It's like, how many times can you get up out of a chair? That's, and as long as it's under 15, you've got something to work with. But as soon as it's over 15, you're way under and need to up the resistance.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because anytime we read this stuff, it's always percentage of a 1 RM.
Right.
Yeah, you can make it very clear that like, well, no, you can do, your repetition max, and then you can calculate your 1 RM.
Because I just don't know how you do an exercise prescription without knowing a repetition maximum. It's just plain guessing.
Yeah.
I get fairly dramatic in class, like, come on.
Yeah. 3 sets of 10 ankle pumps, right, Troy? That's Troy's go-to.
I think sometimes guessing would be an upgrade.
I love it. Troy, you've been quiet. What thoughts do you have?
Sorry, I'm on half kid duty too. So.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind. You and Chris are off the hook then.
I like what everybody else was saying. For home health, I do like, I like the tables a lot. I like the examples a lot, even though it was kind of I kind of got I was picking up what you were putting down on the table. So I think being an educator, I kind of, I hear that a lot just with, can you give me an example? And then when you give an example, they try to take it to heart. Like, no, that's an example.
They want to make it literal. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't, if they don't have an issue with that, you don't have to do that exercise. You can go and put something else in. It's okay. You can use that license that you spent all that time trying to get. It's all right. But yeah, I really like how, because I've used, I've quoted this paper a few times in some of the educational material that I give out, and I just wish it was used a little bit more with what I see, but because I think it's very valuable, and I think it's practical, especially for our setting, like you were saying. I know I've been in and out, but I heard Dale saying, the repetition max and all that kind of stuff. You can bring that into the home, whether it's with hand weights or TheraBands. It's like sometimes 2-pound weights are appropriate, maybe
right.
Maybe not always, but it's not the 2-pound that you carry from patient A to patient Z all the time, and that's everybody's max is 2 pounds. But I think this kind of helps break it down, and I think some of the stuff that we were talking, some of the new information is coming in that I'm kind of excited about is we have a wider range kind of where we can see the benefits, but we still have to use our clinical judgment and our what's best for that patient to apply it to. So there's more possibilities out there, but it still puts even more onus on the therapists themselves to provide that skilled care. And otherwise, you could have anybody just walk around with a 2-pound weight going house to house saying, do this exercise. Who cares?
Right.
Yeah.
I know we're getting low on time, but one of the other things that comes up a lot when I'm teaching is form and kind of when do you quit? So I make a big point about you don't tell someone how many repetitions, you see how many they can do. And people always say, well, when do you quit? And talking a lot about form. And unfortunately, some therapists don't even know form. They don't exercise themselves. So they're not real aware of the implications of valgus, for instance, and knees collapsing and all of that. So that may be something, again, briefly to touch on is, so you talk about failure in this, and that's kind of when you quit. But what does failure really mean? And get a bit concrete about that. Because I do think at least the students get a little freaky about failure. Oh my gosh, does that mean I'm hurting somebody? And no, it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think the form is a common issue, and it's been a common discussion in the SRP Facebook group. And I feel like a thing that is commonly stated but I haven't found any evidence to back this up, but it's just a lot of us that are in the group will kind of chime in with the same sentiment that what's more risky, not loading someone appropriately or potentially, injuring them because we think poor form is going to equate to, X, Y, and Z. Making those assumptions. So which one is more dangerous? Which one is more risky? And just like how to think about that, which is, that's hard to encapsulate, I feel, in words, but yeah, I feel like the common theme has been we want to pay attention to form. We want, to definitely try and achieve, quote unquote good form. But it's a lot of times it doesn't happen.
Right.
and
like
we
when
often shouldn't let stop us.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
In my own exercise, I start something new. It's not pretty.
Right.
But if I just quit doing it, I wouldn't ever be able to do it. So it's
that would be huge. Form, and then I'm here on the tables. Are you, when you said some of the tables that you wanted to take out, are you referring to 2B and 2C?
I am, exactly. Yeah.
I think if somehow you can package and
then I've got room.
Like the RPE and the RM, just like packaging up the tables to gauge intensity with all those, and really emphasizing that, hey, y'all can do, a repetition maximum up to 15 and be able to, if you could package that all up in one,
right?
I feel like those other two, you probably wouldn't need them on there. But I'm wondering if a graph with like the volume, like rep, set, screen, schemes, rest, like if that's worth a table as well.
Good.
This is good
Thank
stuff.
You. Thanks so much.
I'm impressed. Where's Mary Beth Brown?
She's in St. Louis.
Okay.
Not in Columbia. She's retired now.
Okay.
So she's going to be she's not going to kind of keep up with this.
Yeah.
But she was one of those very early therapists that did research on aging rats and people.
Okay.
She did an interesting study. You all might enjoy this, where she took the ovaries out of these older female rats and found that their incentive to exercise just plummeted. They just turned into just hoops, just sitting there, right? And then she gave them estrogen and it didn't come back. So that's one of the things that happens with aging women, is that their energy level and even desire to exercise isn't as strong as when they were younger. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Wow.
It's a hormonal thing. Yeah.
And what does FAPTA stand for again?
Fellow of the American Physical Therapy Association, Dustin.
Yep. Yo, I asked Dale what that meant whenever I interviewed her for the first time, because I didn't have a clue, and she was like,
probably not to know that one.
I'm just
Don't
so
ask
ignorant.
anyone else that.
If I feel like if I would have asked anyone else, I probably wouldn't have got as kind of a response. But you were like, "Oh, Dustin." It was funny. Well, cool. All right, we're at 8:54. Chris, I saw you have a question. How long should I be letting my patients rest in between sets anyway? That's a good question. And I mean, I feel like it depends, are you doing more power training? Or are you trying to do like high intensity interval training with that conditioning element as well? So I'm just saying that right there, that would be, I'll let everyone chime in, but that would be a great SRP Facebook group post as well, to get a lot of different feedback. But what would you all say?
So one of the things that confuses a lot of people is that most of the research on rest comes from athletes and maximum intensity. And so most of the recovery, something like, I've forgotten the exact percentage, but over 80% of the recovery occurs in 20 seconds, maybe even 10 seconds. It's really it doesn't take long. But 100% recovery is a full minute. Sometimes even you'll see research studies that allow 3 to 5 minutes in between these maximum dead out sessions. But for most of our patients, anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds is sufficient. And I typically don't want them to rest at all. I want them to keep going, because that's partly of the endurance aerobic part. And so I just have them do another activity while that muscle's, quote, resting, unquote.
Yeah. Will you flip-flop from like a higher intensity to lower, so maybe some type of balance activity? Or
I'll do quads on a leg press and then get them up and do squats. I'll even do quads again, but they're using them in a different way. Or go upper extremity, or
And one thing,
maximizing that time. See, I think, especially with older adults and Medicare, we're maximizing time, and I don't want them resting. It's not. They can do that at home.
But I have to see my patient for 75 minutes, and they keep falling asleep on me.
Oh,
I remember that in the sniff when I was there.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So does that help, Chris?
I'm just remembering back to my geriatrics class, and I just remember them saying that, like, oh, your patient should be resting longer than a younger person would. And I was thinking to myself, well, if I'm doing like some strength training or something like that, and like the little program thing that I looked up on Google says rest for 3 to 5 minutes, does that mean I have to let my geriatric patient rest for like 10 minutes or something? Like, it's, I was just wondering, because like
now they're resting more than they're exercising.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's what I was just thinking to myself. But I think that's very helpful that you know, instead of just like letting them rest periods only needs to be something like maybe just a minute.
Absolutely. Not even that. Yeah.
It's like an active rest period. I could just have them work on balance instead. Yeah. Awesome.
That's perfect. And older adults have greater fatigue. They resist fatigue better than younger adults. And so they may not need as much rest, interestingly enough. So again, I think we get overly cautious, and I don't know there's any evidence that we need to be that.
Preach it. Troy said, how much rest with ankle pumps, though? 3 to 5 minutes between reps. I think the appropriate response to that question, Troy, is however long it takes you to do your last note. That's how that determines your rest period.
Wow.
Oh, cool. Good stuff. Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. If you only listen to these podcast episodes, you are missing out on 90% of the Senior Rehab Project. Hop on over to seniorrehabproject.com where you can join the movement that's advancing care for older adults. You can join for free or become a part of the Game Changers where you can get some free gear and access to our monthly meetup. Just go to seniorrehabproject.com. I appreciate y'all, and I'll talk with you soon. But in the meantime, do not forget to stay funky.